The sun was just beginning to set, casting a warm orange glow over the quiet suburban street. Amir walked with his hands in his pockets, feeling the crisp evening air against his skin. He had just finished his shift at the small cafe where he worked, and as always, he was looking forward to heading home, calling his mother back in his home country, and getting some rest. Life in a new country hadn't been easy, but he had learned to keep his head down and push forward, hoping for a better future. As he reached the corner store, he stopped for a moment, glancing at the glass door before stepping inside. The soft chime of the bell signaled his entrance. He grabbed a bottle of water and a few snacks, giving a polite nod to the cashier. It was something he had done dozens of times before. But tonight would be different. As Amir stepped outside, his eyes instinctively flickered toward a group of young men leaning against a car. Their voices were loud, their laughter sharp, and something about the way they looked at him sent a cold feeling creeping up his spine. He wasn't one to assume the worst, so he kept walking, minding his own business. But then, "Hey, you," one of them called out. Amir hesitated for half a second before glancing over. The man who had spoken was tall, dressed in a hoodie, his arms crossed over his chest. The others chuckled, their eyes filled with something that wasn't quite friendly. "You lost or something?" another voice added, this one laced with sarcasm. Amir's fingers tightened around the plastic bag in his hand. He had dealt with stares, whispers, even the occasional rude comment before. But this was different. There was a weight in the air, something heavy and unspoken. He could feel his heartbeat quicken, but he forced himself to stay calm. "No," Amir answered simply, his voice steady. "Just heading home." One of the guys took a step closer, smirking. "You sure? 'Cause it kinda looks like you don't belong here." The words hit harder than he expected, but Amir didn't react. He had heard things like this before. He had learned to ignore them. But tonight, ignoring it wouldn't be an option. A nudge to his shoulder made him stumble slightly. His grip tightened on the bag. His instincts screamed at him to just keep walking, to not engage, to not give them the reaction they wanted. But before he could take another step, someone grabbed his wrist. His pulse spiked. He looked up, locking eyes with the guy in front of him. And in that moment, he knew, this wasn't just talk. Something was about to happen. And it would change everything. Amir's breath caught in his throat as he felt the firm grip on his wrist. His mind raced. His first instinct was to pull away, to create distance, but he knew that any sudden move could make things worse. The group wasn't just joking around anymore. There was something in their eyes, a challenge, a silent dare to react. He forced himself to stay calm. "Let go," he said, his voice even but firm. The guy holding his wrist only smirked, tightening his grip for a second before letting go with a small shove. Amir stumbled back a step, but he caught himself. The laughter that followed felt sharp, cutting through the quiet night. His heart pounded, but he kept his face neutral. He knew better than to show fear. "Relax, man," one of them said, holding up his hands like it was all just a joke. "We're just having a little fun. You're new around here, right? Thought we'd give you a proper welcome." Amir didn't respond. He had learned long ago that sometimes silence was the best option. He shifted his weight slightly, calculating the best way to leave without making things worse. Another guy, the one wearing a dark jacket, took a slow step forward. "Where you from, man?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. Amir hesitated. He had answered that question too many times before, and it never led to anything good. But lying wasn't an option either. "I moved here a few months ago," he said simply, avoiding details. The guy in the jacket chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, we figured. You don't exactly fit in, you know?" The words stung, but Amir didn't let it show. He had been through worse. He had left behind everything he knew, stepping into a country that felt both promising and unwelcoming at the same time. He had learned to live with the stares, the assumptions, the moments where he felt like an outsider even when he tried so hard to belong. He took a small step back, hoping they would lose interest. "I don't want any trouble," he said. The guy in the hoodie grinned. "Who said anything about trouble?" he asked, his tone light but his expression anything but friendly. The tension in the air thickened. Amir could feel it pressing down on him, making it harder to breathe. He wasn't sure if they were waiting for him to react or if they were just playing a cruel game, seeing how far they could push him. His mind flashed back to his father's words before he left home. "Be careful. Not everyone will welcome you. Some people fear what they don't understand." He had known this would happen eventually. He had seen enough news stories, heard enough warnings. But knowing didn't make it easier. A car passed by on the street, its headlights briefly illuminating the group. For a second, Amir thought about calling out, about making himself visible enough that someone might step in. But the car kept going, and the moment passed. The guy in the hoodie took another step forward, invading Amir's space. "You nervous?" he asked, tilting his head. Amir met his gaze, refusing to look away. "No." The guy studied him for a moment before laughing, shaking his head. "Man, you're no fun." One of the others sighed dramatically. "Come on, let's go." He's not even reacting. There was a pause, and then just like that, the tension shifted. The group lost interest, turning away, their conversation drifting into something else as if Amir had never been there. It was strange how quickly it happened, how easily they dismissed him once they realized he wasn't going to give them the reaction they wanted. Amir stood frozen for a moment, his body still tense. He forced himself to take a slow breath, to unclench his fists. He had gotten lucky. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his pace steady but quick. He didn't look back, even though he could still hear their voices behind him. By the time he reached his apartment building, his hands were shaking. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, shutting it behind him. The silence of his small apartment felt different tonight, heavier. He sat down on the edge of his bed, staring at his hands. He had always known that being an immigrant in a new country wouldn't be easy. But tonight had been a reminder that sometimes, no matter how much he tried to blend in, some people would always see him as different. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his face with his hands. He wouldn't let this change him. He had come too far, worked too hard, to be broken by one bad night. But still, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not yet. The next morning, Amir stepped out of his apartment, adjusting the strap of his bag over his shoulder. The night before still lingered in his mind, the tension, the feeling of being cornered, the quiet laughter that echoed long after he had walked away. But today was a new day. He had work, responsibilities, and things to focus on. He refused to let one bad encounter define his experience in this country. As he walked toward the cafe, the streets were busier now, filled with the usual sounds of the city waking up, cars honking, people chatting, the distant hum of life moving forward. He liked this time of day, when everything felt normal, like he was just another person going about his routine. The bell jingled as he pushed open the cafe door, and a familiar voice greeted him. "Morning, Amir." Sophie, one of his co-workers, was already behind the counter, tying her apron. She was one of the few people at work who had been kind to him from the beginning. She never made him feel like an outsider. "Morning," he replied, offering a small smile as he grabbed his own apron. "You okay?" she asked, studying him. "You look a little off." Amir hesitated. He had never talked much about his experiences outside of work. He had learned early on that some things were easier to keep to himself. But Sophie had always been genuine, and for some reason, the words slipped out before he could stop them. "Something happened last night," he admitted, keeping his voice low. She frowned. "What kind of something?" Amir glanced around. The cafe wasn't too busy yet, just a few early customers sipping coffee in the corner. He exhaled and leaned slightly closer. "A group of guys stopped me outside the corner store. They didn't do anything, but it was clear they wanted to intimidate me." Sophie's expression darkened. "Did they threaten you?" "Not directly. But it was enough," Amir said. "I don't know. I guess I shouldn't be surprised." Sophie shook her head, looking frustrated. "That's not okay. Did you recognize any of them?" "No," Amir admitted. "But something about them. It felt like they knew I was new around here. Like they had been watching." Sophie sighed. "Some people just can't stand seeing someone different. It's disgusting." Amir appreciated her support, but he didn't want to dwell on it. "It's fine," he said, brushing it off. "They left me alone in the end." Sophie didn't look convinced, but before she could say more, the door swung open, and a few more customers walked in. The conversation ended there, and Amir threw himself into work, letting the rhythm of making coffee and taking orders push everything else to the back of his mind. But the uneasy feeling never really left. Later that evening, as Amir walked home, he found himself glancing over his shoulder more than usual. Every time a group of people laughed nearby, he tensed slightly, expecting to hear one of those familiar voices. He hated feeling paranoid, but the fear was there, just beneath the surface. When he reached the corner store, he hesitated before stepping inside. He told himself he was just being cautious, but deep down, he knew he was checking. Looking for them. The store was mostly empty, just the cashier and an older man browsing the shelves. Amir grabbed a few things and went to pay. As the cashier rang him up, he casually asked, "Hey, have you ever noticed a group of guys hanging around outside? A few of them were out here last night." The cashier, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, glanced up. "You mean those guys with the black hoodies? Yeah, they come around sometimes. Usually late at night. They don't buy anything, just loiter." Amir nodded, his grip tightening on his wallet. "Do they ever bother people?" The cashier hesitated. "They've never done anything serious. Just a lot of talking. Making people uncomfortable." That didn't make Amir feel any better. He thanked the man and stepped outside, scanning the street. Empty. No sign of them. But as he walked home, a nagging thought stayed with him. If they hung around this area, did that mean they lived nearby? Or were they just looking for someone like him, someone easy to single out? The next few days passed uneventfully, but the tension never truly faded. Amir kept his head down, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He started taking different routes home, leaving work at slightly different times, hoping to avoid running into them again. But then, one evening, as he was locking up the cafe alone, he felt it. The presence. He turned slowly, his pulse spiking. Across the street, under the dim glow of a street lamp, stood one of them. The guy in the dark jacket. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. Amir swallowed hard. He forced himself to act normal, slipping his keys into his pocket and adjusting his bag. He didn't want to show fear. But as he stepped onto the sidewalk, the guy smirked. And then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the shadows. Amir stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Amir's footsteps echoed against the pavement as he walked home, his mind racing. The way that guy had stood there, watching him, it wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't random. It was a message. They weren't done with him. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, fists clenched. He hated this feeling. The uncertainty, the waiting, not knowing what they would do next. Would they corner him again? Follow him? Or were they just trying to mess with his head, keeping him on edge? He reached his apartment building and quickly unlocked the door, stepping inside and locking it behind him. The silence felt heavier tonight. He walked over to the window, carefully peeking through the blinds. The street was empty. No sign of anyone. But that didn't make him feel any safer. He exhaled, forcing himself to calm down. He had done nothing wrong. He had come to this country for a better life, worked hard, minded his own business. He wasn't going to let a few guys make him feel like he didn't belong. But what if this escalated? The thought lingered as he sat on the edge of his bed. He had seen how things like this could spiral. He had heard stories. And now, he was living in one. The next morning, he told himself it was just another day. He got ready, left for work, and tried to ignore the lingering paranoia. Everything felt normal at first. The cafe was busy, customers rushing in and out, the usual routine keeping his mind occupied. But then, in the middle of his shift, it happened. The door swung open, and Amir felt his stomach drop. It was them, two of the guys from that night. The one in the hoodie and the one in the dark jacket. They walked in casually, as if they were just regular customers. But Amir knew better. He kept his expression neutral, but he could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. Sophie, who was working beside him, didn't seem to recognize them. She greeted them like any other customer. "What can I get you?" she asked with a polite smile. The guy in the hoodie smirked, leaning slightly over the counter. "How about a coffee? Black?" His friend chuckled. "Same for me." Amir stepped forward, trying to focus on the job. Coming right up. But as he turned to prepare their order, he could feel their eyes on him. He forced himself to stay calm, but his hands trembled slightly as he poured the coffee. "You work hard, huh?" one of them said, his voice casual, but Amir knew there was something more behind it. He didn't respond. He placed their coffees on the counter, keeping his movements steady. "Here you go." The guy in the hoodie picked up his cup, taking a slow sip. "Not bad." Then he looked directly at Amir. "Must be nice, huh? Working here, having a place, walking around like you belong." Amir met his gaze, his jaw tightening. He could feel Sophie glance at him, sensing something was off. "Enjoy your coffee," Amir said, keeping his voice even. The guy smirked, tapping his fingers against the cup. Yeah, we will. They didn't leave right away. They sat at a table near the counter, talking quietly, but Amir could feel their eyes on him the entire time. He tried to focus on his work, but his nerves were on high alert. Every movement, every glance, felt like a test. Sophie leaned in slightly. Who are they? She whispered. Amir swallowed. Same guys from the other night. Her expression darkened. You want me to call someone? No, Amir said quickly. They haven't done anything. Not yet. But deep down, he knew this wasn't just about coffee. When their cups were empty, they finally stood, tossing a few coins onto the table before heading toward the door. Just before stepping out, the guy in the hoodie turned back, looking Amir right in the eyes. See you around, he said. Then they were gone. Amir let out a slow breath, gripping the edge of the counter. Sophie touched his arm gently. Amir, this isn't okay. They're messing with you. He knew she was right. They weren't just leaving him alone. They were showing him that they could show up anywhere. That he wasn't safe. That night, he kept replaying the interaction over and over in his head. He barely slept, his mind racing with what could happen next. The next few days were eerily quiet. Too quiet. He didn't see them, didn't hear anything. It was almost worse, the waiting, the unknown. Were they done? Had they gotten bored? Then, one evening, as he walked home, his worst fear was confirmed. A shadow moved in the alley beside his building. Before he could react, footsteps sounded behind him. He turned, and there they were. The same group. But this time, they weren't just watching. They were waiting. A slow smirk spread across the face of the guy in the hoodie. Told you we'd see you around. Amir's heart pounded. His body tensed. This was it. He wasn't walking away this time. Amir's breath caught in his chest. His mind screamed at him to run, but his feet stayed planted on the cold pavement. His pulse pounded in his ears as he scanned their faces. There were more of them this time, not just the two from the cafe, but the others from that first night outside the store. They stood in a loose semicircle, blocking his way, their expressions unreadable but charged with something unspoken. He forced himself to stay calm. What do you want? He asked, keeping his voice steady. The guy in the hoodie tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. You've got a real attitude, you know that? His smirk didn't reach his eyes. Walking around like nothing ever happened. Like you didn't get the message. Amir swallowed hard. I got the message, he said carefully. I'm just trying to live my life. The guy in the dark jacket let out a low chuckle. Yeah? And what if we don't like that? Amir's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He wasn't sure what they wanted from him. Fear? Submission? An apology for existing? A car passed by, its headlights momentarily lighting up the alley. Amir considered calling for help, but the car kept moving, oblivious to the tension unfolding just outside its windows. Then something unexpected happened. A voice, sharp and firm, cut through the night. Hey, what's going on here? Amir turned toward the sound. A man stood at the entrance of the alley, his stance wide, his expression wary. He was older, probably in his late 40s, with salt and pepper hair and a heavy work jacket. He wasn't someone Amir had ever seen before, but in that moment, he felt like a lifeline. The group hesitated. The man took a step closer. I said, what's going on? His voice held an authority that made Amir wonder if he was a cop or someone who had dealt with this kind of thing before. The guy in the hoodie clicked his tongue, rolling his shoulders like he was annoyed. Nothing, man. Just having a chat. The older man's eyes didn't waver. Didn't look like a chat to me. A tense silence followed. The air was thick, heavy with an invisible tug of war. Then, just as quickly as it started, the moment shifted. The guy in the hoodie exhaled, giving Amir one last unreadable look before shrugging. Whatever. Let's go. One by one, they backed away, their footsteps fading into the night. Amir stayed frozen until they were completely gone. Then, finally, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The older man turned to him. You all right? Amir nodded, though his hands were still shaking. Yeah, thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't shown up. The man studied him for a moment. You live around here? Yeah, just down the street, Amir said, still catching his breath. The man nodded. Be careful. Those guys? They've been causing trouble for a while now. Amir frowned. You know them? A shadow crossed the man's face. Let's just say I've had my own run-ins with them. He glanced down the alley where they had disappeared. They pick their targets. People they think won't fight back. Amir's stomach twisted. And they keep coming back? The man nodded. Until someone stops them. The words hung in the air. A cold realization settled in Amir's chest. This wasn't just about him. If these guys had been doing this for a while, it meant there were others, people like him, who had been cornered, intimidated, made to feel like they didn't belong. And if no one stood up to them, it would never stop. The man checked his watch and exhaled. You should get home. And if you ever see them again, don't handle it alone. Amir nodded slowly. Thanks again. The man gave him a small nod before walking away, leaving Amir alone with his thoughts. As he made his way back to his apartment, something had shifted inside him. The fear was still there, but now, something else burned beneath it. A question. What if he wasn't the only one who had been waiting for someone to stand up? What if this was bigger than just him? He didn't know what he was going to do yet. But one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Amir couldn't shake the conversation with the older man. The warning still echoed in his mind, but so did the challenge, until someone stops them. The fear he had been carrying for days hadn't disappeared, but now, it burned with something stronger. He had spent too much time looking over his shoulder, too much time waiting for something to happen. He couldn't live like this. The next evening, Amir left the cafe with a plan. He wasn't going to run. He wasn't going to hide. If they came for him again, he would be ready. He walked the same route home, the same streets where they had followed him before. He kept his steps steady, his breathing controlled. His heart pounded, but he refused to let fear win. Then, right as he turned onto his block, they appeared. This time, they didn't wait in the shadows. They stepped right into his path, blocking his way. The guy in the hoodie grinned, as if he had been expecting him. Look who's finally showing some confidence, he sneered. Took you long enough. Amir's hands curled into fists. He didn't move back. Didn't let his eyes drop. I'm not afraid of you. The smirk faltered for a split second, just enough for Amir to see that this wasn't how they expected this to go. The guy in the dark jacket scoffed. You should be. He took a step forward, his tone dripping with threat. But before Amir could respond, another voice cut through the night. Hey, enough of this. Everyone turned. Sophie was standing a few feet away, her phone in her hand, the screen lit up. And she wasn't alone. Behind her, a few other people from the neighborhood had gathered, faces Amir recognized from the cafe, the market, people who had seen these guys lurking for too long. Some had their phones out, recording. Others just stood firm, their presence a silent message. The guy in the hoodie's expression darkened. What is this? Sophie lifted her chin. It's called witnesses. The tension shifted instantly. The power they had held over Amir, the intimidation, the fear, it was slipping. The guy in the dark jacket muttered under his breath, glancing around. This is stupid. The guy in the hoodie looked at Amir for a long moment, something unreadable in his eyes. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. The others followed. Amir stood frozen, watching them disappear into the night. For the first time in days, he felt something he hadn't expected. Relief. Sophie walked up to him. You okay? Amir let out a breath, nodding. Yeah. He looked at the small crowd still standing nearby, the people who had come, the ones who had made sure he wasn't alone. He had been so focused on surviving by himself that he hadn't realized something important. He wasn't alone. As the crowd started to disperse, Sophie nudged him. You know they won't try this again, right? Amir glanced down the empty street where the group had vanished. I hope not. Then, as he turned toward his apartment, he caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. A single figure stood at the far end of the street, watching. It wasn't the guy in the hoodie. It was someone else, someone Amir hadn't seen before. And just as quickly as he noticed them, they slipped into the shadows. A chill ran down his spine. This wasn't over. Not yet. Amir stood frozen for a moment, his heart still racing from the confrontation. But now, a different kind of fear settled in his chest. The others had left, but that stranger, the one who had been watching from the shadows, felt like an unspoken warning. Sophie followed his gaze, frowning. What is it? Amir hesitated, then shook his head. Nothing. Just, thought I saw something. She studied him for a moment but didn't push. Come on, let's get out of here. As they walked back toward his building, Amir kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone still lurking in the darkness. But the street was empty. The night was quiet again. Sophie sighed, breaking the silence. You know, you don't have to go through this alone. Amir nodded slowly. I know. And for the first time, he really meant it. Over the next few days, things started to feel normal again. The guys who had been harassing him didn't show up at the cafe, didn't follow him home. It was like they had vanished. Maybe they had realized they couldn't intimidate him anymore. Or maybe they just didn't want the attention now that the neighborhood had stepped in. Either way, Amir wasn't complaining. But that feeling, the one from that night, never fully left him. That stranger, the way they had just stood there, watching. It haunted him. One evening, he finally decided he needed answers. He found himself retracing his steps, walking back toward the alley where everything had escalated. The air was crisp, the streetlights flickering dimly above him. He wasn't sure what he expected to find. Maybe nothing. Maybe he was just being paranoid. But then, as he turned the corner, he saw him. The same figure from that night. This time, he wasn't in the shadows. He was leaning against the wall, hands in his pockets, as if he had been waiting. Amir's stomach tightened, but he forced himself to keep walking. He wasn't running. Not this time. As he got closer, the man looked up. His face was older than Amir expected, mid-50s, maybe even older. His eyes were sharp, but there was no hostility in them. "You handled yourself well the other night," the man said, his voice calm. Amir frowned. "Who are you?" The man exhaled, glancing down the street before answering. "Just someone who's seen this happen too many times." He paused. "I wanted to see if you'd fight back." Amir's fists clenched slightly. "So, what? You were testing me?" The man shook his head. "Not like that. But I needed to know if you were someone who'd stand up, or someone who'd disappear." The words sent a chill through Amir. "Why do you care?" The man studied him for a moment before answering. "Because I was you. A long time ago." Amir stared at him, something clicking into place. The way he had spoken that night, how he had known those guys had done this before. He had been through it. The man sighed. People like them? They count on fear. They count on people staying silent, keeping their heads down. He looked Amir in the eye. But once someone pushes back, everything changes. Amir swallowed, feeling the weight of his words. He had spent so much time being afraid, thinking this was just his problem. But it wasn't. It never had been. "What happens now?" Amir asked quietly. The man gave a small, knowing smile. "That's up to you." For the first time in weeks, Amir felt like he had control again. He wasn't just reacting anymore, he was making a choice. As he walked away, he realized something. The fear might never fully go away. But now, he knew something even more important. He wasn't alone, and he never would be again.